So how many people use MySQL or some sort in the hosted cloud? RDS? Okay. Cloud SQL from Google? HP Cloud? Rackspace? Azure Cloud? No. Yeah, Azure doesn't offer MySQL by default. They only do it via a third-party company called ClearDB. And they're the same company that does MySQL for Heroku as well. Does anybody here use a database in the hosted cloud out of curiosity?
Hoping that you can talk us into it or out.
Okay. Okay. Fair enough. In 1 minute, I will start.
Does anyone remember the Wi-Fi password?
Network backwards. Oh, with an exclamation mark and then network backwards. Crow 10. I think. Exclamation Croton. Okay, we will start. It is officially time now. So I'm here to talk to you about MySQL in the hosted cloud. I am Colin Charles. I work on this little database called MariaDB. Has anybody here heard of MariaDB before? Okay, so you can pop by our booth later maybe. I've been in the MySQL world for a very long time. As you can see, I've gone through maybe 4 different companies, or at least names of companies, with regards to working on the same thing in more than a decade. And before that, I used to work on Fedora Linux as well as OpenOffice.org. My agenda is pretty set. I'm going to talk to you about the offerings that are available, your choices, why you may consider using the cloud or not. The versions are pretty important because some people used to offer really old versions at some stage, and this kind of talk evolves pretty quickly as we go along. So every year you obviously have new things. Costs are obviously a big reason why people may look into the cloud, but you don't only look at the costs of your solution in RDS, you also look at the cost of hiring DBAs and so forth. And then I also would like to talk about EC2 or an equivalent like Google Compute Engine and so forth, as well as give you some conclusions. I'm open to questions, and if it's going to be asked in the next slide, I'll say just wait till the next slide, and I'm obviously open to answering questions afterwards as well. So when it comes to MySQL as a service, we really are talking about databases as a service. Think of it like software as a service for databases. I don't know how many of you today still have the problem of having to, decide that you're going to embark on a project, fill out a requisition form, get approvals, order the hardware, rack them, and then basically install the OSs. So, from the time you decide you're going to start a project to the time you actually start the project takes like a month. I don't know if that's still a very common problem today, especially not in California, I'm guessing. Because today, if you want to start a project, ideally you just fire up a cloud instance somewhere. And I'm not even saying you have to use one of these clouds that are very ephemeral. You could also start up an instance at Linode or DigitalOcean and keep it there, keep it running as well. But I'm going to talk to you about just the component that is the database as a service, where MySQL is generally always available and on demand, and you generally have 0 configuration options that you want to use or actually get to use. There are very minimal configuration options, so to speak. And that depends, varying on service as well. And you're obviously paying per usage, so usually you pay by the hour as opposed to paying by the month, or buying upfront and paying for like 3 years and amortizing it over time. And the real bonus of having MySQL as a service is the provider that you have actually entrusted to run the service actually manages it for you. They do things like backups, they do upgrades, etc. And upgrades are kind of important in the MySQL world because I'd say that every 3 months Oracle will have this thing called a critical patch update, which basically says they fixed a whole bunch of CVE bugs that are security related. So you kind of want to update at least once every 3 months. And then with MariaDB or even Percona Server, every time we find a bug, a gaping hole, we fix it in less than 48 hours. largely because we have a distribution network. We talk to the Linux distributions and then we update it as well. So keeping up to date is kind of important. I mean, MySQL has been around for nearly 20 years, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have security bugs in it. So the new way of deployment that I presume many of you are already using is that you basically just enter a credit card number and you call an API. Either you can call an API like the EC2 instance. If you're using OpenStack, you can do Nova Boot. Every time I want to do this talk, I realize I can get a lot of frequent flyer miles because I have to use my credit card quite actively, and it's a great way to get more miles. And I actually do know, I don't know if you guys hear of this service called SmugMug. No? It's like a photo sharing website. The founder of SmugMug actually backed Amazon S3 like when it first came out, and then he's really on Amazon a lot. He even had like a black Amex because he was running all his bills through S3. So running in the cloud can also lead to fame and fortune. So why database as a service? Sometimes people just want a few more servers. And this is quite typical, especially during times of spikes, maybe elections, maybe plane crash. Wait, plane go missing. Those sort of things are pretty common. You have new spikes. You kind of want more database servers. You kind of want more front-end servers. The front-end servers are much easier to deploy than database servers because when you deploy MySQL, you also need to make sure you warm up the buffer pool. And you got to make sure that the servers actually, got all the consistent data. So I would say that warming up databases is much harder, and turning it off is much less frequent than, say, turning off a front-end web server. Also, I checked on Indeed, and the average for a MySQL DBA is about $120,000 a year. And that's not like a fully competent DBA, it's like a junior DBA. Consultants may cost way more than that. Like, it's not unheard of that people get paid $300,000 to $500,000 to maintain databases, depending on which company you work at. And consultants usually start at $2,000 to $2,500 a day, so you can work that out. So the another real reason why people tend to use database as a service is because you don't really have a lot of DBAs. If you're starting out and then you're organically growing, you don't really have DBAs on board. And with the DevOps movement and so forth, people tend to have a lot less operational people around. They're doing more things. The other thing you get is also obviously full rapid deployment. That's I think quite useful. I mean, if you want to start a new RDS instance, it takes like 10 minutes at max. If you want to start something in Google, maybe it takes like a minute at max. As long as you've got, you can pay for it, you're good to go. In fact, many of these services also offer the ability for you to use the database as a service for free. Now, you don't want to do that in reality because you don't want to run on a free version of RDS or on a T1 micro instance because they don't actually give you the full clock time and you get really, really awful performance. You don't actually get performance, you just get a database that you can play with. You don't get anything near to reality, so I wouldn't use the free tier options. But if they give you free credits, that's a different story. Like Google has a starter plan that gives you like $1,000 of credits. You can do whatever you want with the $1,000 credits. I think that's actually pretty good because you can spend the credits within a year. If you have a fairly beefy SQL server, you may spend it like within a month or less. So keep that in mind as well. Like Amazon, I think, does this as well. They do this with startups that work with certain accelerators and so forth. Now, when I say rapid deployment, also keep in mind that things like RDS actually limit you to, say, 40 databases per account. This is all in the fine print that many people don't really read. And after that, you have to apply for more. So so this is again part of capacity planning. So if you're already going to like 20 RDS instances or 30, make sure that you plan ahead because it doesn't happen instantly. You actually have to tell Amazon, yes, this credit card is good, please, charge me more. And when I say rapid scale out, things like Amazon and Rackspace can take up to 10 minutes to create a database instance. So for my benchmarks, I see Google Cloud SQL being the fastest, but it still takes time. Today you're given many, many choices. AWS is by far the most popular and the most mature, so we'll spend a lot of time on that as well. Rackspace, cloud databases, and they were interesting because they were on a really old version of MySQL, and then when they upgraded, they gave you the opportunity of MySQL, Percona Server, as well as MariaDB 10. So Rackspace is actually pretty interesting. Then there's Google Cloud SQL. These people actually give you lots of credits. You can run MySQL 5.5 and experimentally MySQL 5.6 as well. And out in the boots, there's also HP Helion, public cloud. They also offer relational database as a service, though I'd say that they're mostly still very much in beta. It's really not graduated out of beta for quite some time. And the interesting thing about Rackspace and HP is that both those services are actually, so if you are planning for your own hosted cloud or you want to make a private cloud, with OpenStack, you can start deploying in public clouds as well as move stuff back to your private clouds. So this is an added bonus of trying out those services. But there are more. Jelastic is a platform as a service offering both MySQL and MariaDB, mainly focused on Java applications. In fact, they quite interesting because every quarter they release a report about their most popular databases, and it turns out MariaDB is more popular than MySQL. So that might be worth taking a look at. There's also ClearDB. If you happen to be using Heroku, previously AppFog, even Azure, you would end up basically using MySQL via ClearDB. So you don't only, you build through Heroku or Azure, but actually the service is run by ClearDB. Then there's also Joyent. I don't know how many people here use Joyent. Anybody use Joyent? They're interesting because not only do they offer MySQL, Percona MySQL, they also have this idea of Joyent smart machines where they don't have Linux as a base. It's a different OS base that was loosely based on Open Solaris. So you get dtrace functionality and so forth, and that's what they call smart machines. So again, something well worth looking into. There are also new entrants. If you're thinking of, has anybody here heard of Galera cluster before? MariaDB or Percona XDB cluster? Yeah, okay. So Galera cluster generally requires you to set up like 3 nodes. Maybe you need to set up HA proxy in front of it, etc. But if you ever wanted to have Galera cluster in a box, like how easy it is to set up MySQL replication, basically Google Compute Engine offers Percona XDB cluster as a click to deploy app. You just click one button, you say, I approve billing on this application, and then you can actually launch an instance. You basically get 3 instances that are their N1 standards with about half a terabyte worth of disk. Now, the interesting thing about this is that this is not database as a service, really. It's a service that offers you a Galera cluster that you have to maintain yourself. So it is just part of Google Compute Engine. It spins up an image. So it's very much like those Amazon machine images that you get that spin up, except this one spins up 3 images, not 1. There's also Pivotal Cloud Foundry, which through all its marketing material will tell you it is a MySQL platform as a service, until you read the documentation or actually use the service and then find out, oh, actually this is MariaDB Galera Cluster 10. Which is basically, again, Galera cluster in a box by Pivotal. This service literally just launched early February, I think February 9th or so of this year. So it's relatively new. They used to be all MySQL, and then they upgraded to MariaDB Galera cluster. And then there's also OpenShift, where they provide cartridges for either MySQL or MariaDB. Does anybody here use OpenShift as a platform as a service? Okay, so there's also a Red Hat booth upstairs. They can talk to you more about OpenShift and the fact that they're doing more interesting work around Kubernetes as well as Docker. They're not just basing it on their own little OpenShift thing any longer. And they all have support for MySQL and MariaDB. Now, beware the cloud though. You got to pick your companies really carefully. GenieDB had a lot of promise, raised, I don't know, maybe $7 million worth of funding. They said they were going to be a globally distributed database that worked across multiple platforms. They kind of went bankrupt silently last year, silently as well. They didn't tell anybody that they were closing down. Zround was pretty popular 2 years back. They were basically offering you MySQL in the cloud, hosted in EC2 instances, because RDS was still not very mature 2 years ago. And they gave their customers literally 2 weeks notice to migrate their data. And that was it. So pick a big company, which is the companies I talked about earlier, not two small ones. ClearDB, I'm not so sure either. So I'm going to focus on the larger ones. Now, when it comes to understanding the cloud, you have to think about regions and availability zones a lot. This is an Amazon graphic where basically you understand that a region is a collection of zones. However, a zone is generally isolated location within a region. And the OpenStack equivalent to this, so you understand this for Rackspace or even HP as well as your own, is that in OpenStack, zones are roughly comparable to an AWS region. So the terminology is different, but the understanding is it's almost the same, basically. And Google is by far the most compatible in terms of zones and regions, in the sense that they actually follow AWS. So OpenStack decided to basically rewrite it when they were going from scratch. They didn't want to have necessarily AWS compatibility. Location matters. Location matters because price matters. Now, when it comes to locations like Amazon, where they actually, I believe they launched in US East in North Virginia, they have something along the lines of 5 availability zones in that region. But then there are some regions where they, like Singapore, for example, where they only have 2 availability zones available for you. So it varies depending on region as to how many availability zones you have. And sometimes you may want to plan to have your data stored in more than one availability zone, generally speaking, and for geographical replication and capabilities, you want to be in more than one region. Rackspace is a funny company, because for the rest of the world, that's the US and Asia, you can have one account. But if you want to store anything in your London data center, you actually need to have another account. So you can't actually keep them in one consolidated account. It's very odd. Needless to say, so I'm just going to go back to AWS, is that if you decide to start using AWS, I would suggest creating another account besides your Amazon shopping account, which I presume all of you have. This is for various reasons, such that you can enable extra security measures on the other account. And in the event that you happen to sell your company or sell the asset, you don't want to also sell the history of your Amazon purchases. Believe me, this is actually a problem. The others don't actually offer any grocery shopping, so you'll be fine. Now, Rackspace is also really interesting in the sense that their SLAs basically say we can give you 100% network uptime. That's what they claim. So they actually say you don't need multiple availability zones like you would need in Amazon. Now, in Amazon, having multiple availability zones makes sense. A couple of weeks ago, or was it last week, anybody who bought a Fire phone would find that your Fire phone wouldn't work. I'm guessing not many people are affected by it because you don't have a Fire phone. But about a year before that, actually last year they were really good, but the year before that they had a couple outages where things like Netflix would just go away. And that probably affects quite a lot of you, because I'm sure many have Netflix subscriptions. So having multiple availability zones makes sense. Generally, I would say you should probably do that even in Rackspace, even though they claim 100% network uptime. Google has 3 availability zones in the US and 2 in Europe and Asia. And HP Cloud also has 3 availability zones per region. But you will find, funnily enough, because like I said, this service has still very much been in beta for over 2 years, that you can get the RDS equivalent, the MySQL as a service in US West, but US East does not offer it. SLAs matter. With both Google and AWS, they basically tell you have about 22 minutes of downtime a month. This is pretty common. They only give you about 99.95% uptime. Now, if you run on AWS, the reality is that this is a lot longer, because AWS has this weekly update cycle. So the scheduled maintenance may give you downtime of up to 142 minutes a month. This is why they always encourage you to have copies of your data, be it read replicas or replicate instances elsewhere. HP Cloud still does not have an SLA for some reason, but I guess that's the bonus of being in beta. They charge you, but there's no real SLA. Now, with regards to Rackspace, even though they claim to give you no network downtime, they do state that there is only 99.9%, so 3 nines uptime, average of about 45 minutes of downtime a month. So depending on what kind of tolerance you have to failure, this is probably important for you to remember. So Netflix regularly runs Chaos Monkey across their nodes to ensure that nodes are coming up and going down as and when they please, and they want to make sure that the service doesn't actually interrupt the user. I'd highly recommend that you would do the same, because you want to make sure your user is never affected by maintenance cycles or maybe downtime. Now, a huge chunk of why people use the cloud is because they don't want to pay a DBA. But sometimes they grow to a stage where they don't want to pay a remote DBA, but they still need to get support. So there's this middle ground where you have a bunch of machines and you need some kind of support. Now, in terms of support, I think Rackspace probably wins. They really do have fanatical support. Their live chat works wonders. And if that doesn't work, they'll call you on the phone. It doesn't matter if it's a holiday either. They will call you. AWS has forums, and they give you email within about 12 hours support. But then they give you real support that starts at $100, but it goes up to usage. So the usage, once you start calculating, adds up to about $15,000 a year for an average-sized amount of RDS instances. Google can give you, it starts again at $150 a month. They have a 1 hour response time that is about $400 a month. That actually gives you a number to call. I don't know if you ever tried calling Google, but it's really hard to find a phone number for them. They really don't like you calling. But for the privilege of paying them, you can actually get that. And HP Cloud, despite being in beta, also has relatively good support via live chat and phone as well. Their forums are not as active. AWS forums are actually really active. Now, when it comes to management, it tends to also be tied with a support contract. And AWS, it's all self-management, but if you want an enterprise support contract, as I said, it starts at $15K a year. Rackspace is $100 plus 4 cents an hour. And the others don't offer any form of management. So if you're looking for management, you need to go to a company that offers remote DBA services, basically. With regards to versions of MySQL, how many here use MySQL 5.1? Wow. 5.5? 5.6? Okay. So AWS by far has the best support for MySQL. You can either roll out 5.1, 5.5, 5.6. Rackspace is very updated now. They offer MariaDB 10, Percona 5.6, as well as MySQL 5.6 and 5.1. Google is still shipping 5.5 as a default, but 5.6 has been in preview for about a year now. And Google doesn't upgrade every month like Amazon does. Amazon, you pretty much get an upgrade every month as long as upstream releases an upgrade. Google tends to upgrade every few months. I've noticed 3 to 4 months as a gap between an upgrade in versions. And HP Cloud is offering a older version of Percona Server 5.5. I think access methods are pretty important when it comes to the cloud, because you are probably very used to typing MySQL -h IP address or hostname -u -p. Now, with Amazon, you can access it within Amazon externally from a client. Like I could access my Amazon from here, from my laptop here, and so forth. Whereas Rackspace is actually very interesting in the sense that they actually lock you out. They don't open your database to the external network. So for you to access your Rackspace database, you also need to start up compute instances on Rackspace. Most likely you are going to do this in production anyway, because you don't want to store your data in EC2 and store your database in Rackspace for latency reasons. But this is definitely worth thinking about. With regards to Google, they do provide a command line Java client. They also allow the standard MySQL client, no problem there. HP even allows you to use the Trove clients from OpenStack. So most give you external access, most give you API access, and some don't. So Rackspace doesn't. Now it's well worth noting that this can change in the future. So for people who are already using MySQL very actively, there comes the question, can you configure MySQL? For one, you don't have access to my.cnf. In AWS, you do have access to this thing called parameter groups, which allows you to edit some things like my.cnf, but it doesn't allow you to. There are many immutable options. MySQL, the base MySQL has about 523 options. Some of them are NDB specific, so we discount them. But RDS only provides 283, as that graph will show you. And 58 of them are immutable, so you can't change things like base directory, data directory, because every time you start up a RDS instance, what you're doing is really starting up EC2 and RDS with a managed console interface in front of it, right? That's actually what's happening. Now, the catch of running things in, say, Amazon is that you don't have access to things like audit logs. You don't get to use the memcache daemon in 5.6. You don't get to fiddle with bin log settings, so you can't say sig bin log equals 0, for example. You don't get full access to the performance schema. You can get that through an interface on the web. You don't get to fiddle with the relay log settings. You don't get to turn on semi-synchronous replication. So MySQL application is fully asynchronous, but there is a semi-sync plugin. You don't get to have SSL turned on if you want to use that. And technically, if you're using the cloud, you might want to have SSL enable logins. They kind of recommend you to use Amazon VPC with SSL as the workaround. And if you're using, you're building a web app, say a messaging app or something, you might want to use a thread pool where you have very short-running queries. So MySQL Enterprise has a thread pool, MariaDB open source, as well as Percona has open source version of the thread pool, where you don't have to open up one thread per connection, but you can actually just open up a pool of threads and reuse them. You can't get access to the thread pool using RDS or any of the other cloud services, with the exception of Rackspace. My suggestion is to subscribe to each and every relevant newsletter out there. If you are going to use it, subscribe to the newsletters. Read the blogs, because they announce price cuts pretty often. But sometimes it's not just price cuts. Like in September last year, Amazon, for example, offered new high memory instances. So it's not a price cut, but you get better high memory instances. You may actually get rid of more machines in favor of one instance. So you can actually consolidate. I think that actually is a huge bonus. I think when I ran the costs, I believe the DB M2 X4 large would save 2.1 times versus the DB M2 X4 large. So you want to definitely consolidate workloads on a regular basis. The other thing that you probably need to check with regards to cost is network access cost. Many people think that you only have to pay for database costs, but you also have network access costs. So you definitely want to look at that. Network access usually, sometimes within their own networks, tend to be cheap or free, but when it goes externally, it's not. AWS prices totally vary between regions. They haven't actually changed on RDS pricing since I think around March of last year. So maybe we're due for upgrade soon. You don't have to look at that. You can get that on Amazon.com as well. The US is by far the cheapest. The EU is pricier. Singapore is pretty much matched. Sao Paulo is ridiculously expensive. But if you want to bid on spot instances, which you can do for cloud stuff, it's very cheap in Sao Paulo. So if, for testing purposes, maybe that is a great place to do things. So like I said, the last price drop was around mid 2014. We haven't had a price drop yet this year, but you can actually see that the price drops pretty radically. Like if you're just testing and you have 4 gigs of RAM, you're going from 1500 this year even, and the year before it was like 2400 in 2013. So when the price drops, it drops pretty rapidly. And the bonus of a price drop is that if one announces a price drop, usually they all follow suit. So it actually gets cheaper for you over time, as opposed to buying hardware, which you amortize over time, and then have to buy new hardware. This is also similar with regards to large instances and so forth. Now, as a word of warning, one thing Amazon does that nobody else does is offer something called provisioned IOPS. So you get a guaranteed set of IOPS, say up to 30,000 IOs per second. Now, if you go and buy an instance like, say, m2.xl, you will find that you're paying for 15 gigs of RAM, but finding that there are no provisioned IOPS available for you. So be very careful. In production, you may want to actually have provisioned IOPS available. Rackspace has something similar to that effect, because they had acquired ObjectRocket, and ObjectRocket likes to make databases faster. So depending on your use case, MariaDB can be faster, because if the underlying hardware is Fusion IO, it can be faster than MySQL. Now, I checked a Dell R910 with about half a terabyte of RAM goes for about 19 grand today. The pricing above, by the way, is with multiple availability zones enabled. You can obviously reduce costs tremendously with just not having multi-AZ, but I don't see much point in that. And the other thing is, if you buy it for a year, you can also reduce costs. Reserved instance pricing is a lot cheaper. So, with regards to costs on Rackspace, I'm trying to compare similarly as well. It tends to be a little bit more expensive than AWS. Their 8 gigabyte instance in benchmarks show about 2100 transactions per second, which is not too bad. Generally, you get 64 MySQL threads you can open up for all flavors except the smallest one, the 512 megabyte one. I don't recommend that, obviously. And you can go up to 64 gigabytes in size with regards to instances. Now, this is nothing compared to what you can get on Amazon. Amazon is still by far the most you can get today. It's again a similar story with Google. Google, the largest you can go for is a D32. So that's a 30 gigabyte size instance. Google is very interesting. The way they do costing, they also check how much I/O you use per day, and that is included in your quota. So you may actually hit your I/O quota and have to pay more money. Here also, the max size of a MySQL database on disk is 500 gigabytes in size, and that storage is included in the price. But the amount of RAM you can get, only 32 gigs. In testing, you really want to watch for the max concurrent connections, because if you have a D8 instance and you run sysbench against it, so that's an 8 gigabyte RAM instance, you only have 1,000 concurrent connections you can open up. Not very useful. And a D16 offers like 2,000 instances. So they're encouraging you to spread your load by actually firing out more instances. These people haven't really dropped much in price. They only responded to Amazon mid of last year, and that was pretty much it. If you're looking for cheap, HP is by far the cheapest, because they have a 50% discount while they're in public beta, and they have been for 2 years. When it comes to hosting apps, I highly recommend that you host it in the same cloud your database as a service is in, I wouldn't put it elsewhere. This also means that if you host it in Google, you have very limited language choices. If you host it in Heroku, it's even more limited language choices. So be very careful with regards to your cloud choices. But you're probably already getting the fact that Amazon and Rackspace are like clear winners here. Now, with regards to RDS, they have this option called multiple availability zones. It basically has synchronous data replication on the block storage side. It doesn't actually do synchronous data replication in the database. So this is very much such that it's block replication across availability zones. So you can have it across multiple AZs in the same region. It is definitely implemented with some variant of DRBD. So when you benchmark multi-AZ versus just a regular RDS instance, you will notice a performance gap. Because DRBD, while it gives you synchronous data replication, does not give you the performance that you expect out of it. In Sysbench benchmarks, there is easily a 30 to 40% drop in performance, which is why when you do multi-AZ, they only charge you 50% more because you have a passive master waiting, but you can't use it, and you actually have performance degradation. This is actually okay. It's an okay trade-off to pay, because I found out that with regards to Postgres is also offered on RDS, and if you're interested in that, there's Josh Burkus is giving a talk tomorrow, probably in the same room at around the same time, about Postgres and RDS. And while we get a 50% discount on multi-AZ, the Postgres people pay 100%, so there is no discount. So actually, MySQL is cheaper in that sense. Yes? They don't have multi-region, so this is another benefit of where you go and look into EC2. You can't, DRBD doesn't allow you to do multi-region well. It's only good for availability zones in the same region. That's how we can guess it's based on DRBD. They don't actually tell us it's based on DRBD. It's an educated guess. So I guess that's going further, where I think we'd probably recommend that running in EC2, if you have the knowledge, is actually possibly much better than running RDS. RDS is good for starting. It's great for, the first 40 servers you want to run. And after that, maybe you need to think about expanding. So with automatic failover, this can be slow because it's DRBD failover, basically. It can take anywhere between 1 to 10 minutes. Now, if you use an external solution, like in EC2, you could run MHA, and failover can happen in less than 30 seconds. I would take 30 seconds over 10 minutes any day, with no loss of data. However, there is no good easy GUI for MHA. MHA is all command line. It's all scripted. It's written in Perl. This one has a nice point-and-click GUI. You really can't beat that. As I said, it doesn't give you a read replica. Now, with regards to external replication, this is actually pretty interesting. With MySQL 5.6, you can finally do RDS to non-RDS. That means you can do RDS to Google Cloud SQL. You can go out of RDS. As long as you enable backup retention, you actually have bin log access. This is a huge bonus because this was a problem with RDS in previous versions of MySQL. You couldn't get data out. And if you're obviously looking for replicating data into RDS, there is a stored procedure that allows you to do that. This is easy. This portion is very easy. Now, let's compare this with Rackspace. Rackspace allows both internal and external. So whatever version you're using, be it MySQL, Percona, or MariaDB, you can do internal and external replication with ease. Of course, with the caveat that you would be sending it to Rackspace server and then copying the dump later. Google Cloud SQL has read replicas, but they are in beta. And you can send data out, but you end up having to look at the cost of network traffic that goes out as well. So again, may not be the cheapest. HP Cloud, not at the moment. There is something else that comes with 5.6 that's quite interesting. It's called the binlog streaming API that's available in MySQL binlog. And that one you can actually use to basically extract data out of the bin log and stream it. And you can maybe use it to, update search indexes or even invalidate caches on non-RDS slaves. So you can actually stream to EC2 MySQL instance and use it for that purpose. It's not too bad. It's only 5.6 though. And then there's another tool that I should probably mention called Tungsten Replicator. Has anybody heard of that or used it before? Okay. So Tungsten also allows replication into and out of RDS. They also allow you to, if you pay them money, to replicate easily from RDS to, say, Rackspace and so forth. And that's something not many people are really offering, having it available in 2 services or 3 services. And that could be, many reasons like continuity, that you'd want to have your data replicated in another service and in use at the same time. Now, for the people still running MySQL 5.1 or 5.5, I highly recommend you take a look at MySQL 5.6 or MariaDB 10. As I said earlier, performance schema is not really available in the UI, but you can enable and disable it via SQL and collect the data that way. I find performance schema very useful when I'm developing against the database. I don't find it that useful when it's already in production, but while I'm developing, it makes a lot of sense. Generally, the easiest way to import data into the cloud is to use MySQL dump. And you're thinking, I've been using extra backup all this time. How come I can't use it? Well, that's the other disadvantage of this hosted systems. You can't use the tools you're familiar with. It's also worth noting that in Cloud SQL, for example, Google Cloud SQL, you can't simply run the command load data in file to actually import data. They actually disable load data in file. But they will provide an interface to read your MySQL dumps. And if you're upgrading from RDS 5.5 to 5.6, the old way was actually to MySQL dump and restore. But I would say about 11 months ago, they allow you to actually just do this via read replicas. So this is now a much easier upgrade path for all of you. Back to backups. You can't use extra backup. The educated guess as to how Amazon would be doing this would be EBS snapshots. You are also allowed to save snapshots and save it in S3. This is kind of handy. Google Cloud SQL also automates backups. Basically, it has a backup window that can state around 4 hours. And you can back up your entire instance in Rackspace and HP Cloud. Now, when it comes to backups, I think it's well worth noting that even if you think you've destroyed your instance, make sure you've destroyed your backups or destroyed your data, because you may end up with a bill that includes the data that didn't get destroyed. Like with Amazon, the option destroy data is pretty easy. But with Rackspace, the data is still kept on disk even though you've destroyed the database. This could be good from a backup standpoint, but not so good from a credit card standpoint. When it comes to monitoring, AWS has by far the best monitoring available, and even then it is really, really limited compared to what you're normally used to, say, in say Enterprise Monitor or Moniog. Google has really basic read-write graphs. If I had shown you screenshots, you might actually laugh. Rackspace also has very basic graphs. They do claim that very soon they will actually integrate MySQL into Cloud Intelligence. It's still very much a beta at the moment, but we're hoping that they will come up with another product that we could actually really rely on. You can't use many storage engines when you decide to use RDS or Rackspace Cloud and so forth. You can't decide you want to use TalkyDB for good insert speeds or compression. You can't decide you want to load the Connect engine. So as I said, Rackspace offers MariaDB 10. But when you try to actually load something like the Connect engine, and this is not specified in any documentation and so forth, they'll just tell you the insert command is denied for the root user. So you just can't load external storage engines. You can only load the storage engines that they provide because everything else is disabled for you. So you really only have the choice of InnoDB or MyISAM. And for things like Amazon's read replica, multi-AZ backups, you really can only use InnoDB. You can't use MyISAM for that either. When it comes to HA, I think you really need to plan for node failures. When it comes to the cloud, nodes fail quite commonly. Sometimes you also have a crappy node. It's like a really bad node. You kill it, start another one, performance improves tremendously. People always think the cloud is like, oh, I want this instance today. It'll be ready like in the next minute. Don't assume this is true. RDS really does have pretty good HA. Rackspace at the moment is still very much single node, so it's not. They don't really have HA properly yet. If you're using 5.6 and you think, oh, I could use global transaction IDs, Amazon has a surprise for you. GT IDs do not work. They've disabled that feature. You can't warm the InnoDB cache. You can't use semi-sync replication to ensure that at least the slave has received the update. You can't use any authentication plugins, be it the PAM authentication plugin to authenticate against an external system. You're kind of stuck with whatever they want to provide you. Google doesn't even allow user-defined functions. And it's DR replication or no replication. You can't have funky replication access. Provisioned IOPS, very useful in production. You can get up to 30,000 IOPS. I would say this is definitely well worth looking at, but it's also worth noting that using POPS is probably better than raiding stuff yourself on EBS, because you can take your provision IOPS up and down dynamically as you choose. One thing to always remember though, when it comes to provisioned IOPS versus RAID, is that on RAID you can control the size of pages. MySQL page size is 16 kilobytes. MariaDB takes away this limitation, allowing you up to 64 kilobyte pages. But you can't have that control when you use RDS with POPS. You can have more control when you format the file system yourself. Yes?
I think it's also, you can also run MySQL, MariaDB, or anything on a standard EC2 instance and have provisioned IOPS. Like provisioned IOPS are not necessarily.
They're not necessarily for RDS, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, provisioned IOPS is available for everything. So I'm rooting towards the fact that it's better for you to run on EC2 as opposed to RDS if you know what you're doing.
Yeah.
If you don't know what you're doing or you don't have DBA capabilities, then definitely RDS is a good choice. With regards to RDS, if you're trying to do things like log forensics, try downloading the slow log or general query log. This is actually a download. It's kind of painful. Then you have to, parse it either using the API or pull down log files. So not very useful. If you have replication errors, you don't have super access. You can't turn off the binary log syncing because that is again a requirement of DRBD. You don't have access to the OS, so you don't really know you can't really identify if it's an OS problem. So RDS is a nice tool, but it is limited. Also, we'll give you another warning with regards to RDS. It has automatic upgrade features, which is great, generally, except when there are bugs. These are a couple of bugs that occurred to RDS users who were complaining. And these bugs get introduced in point releases in MySQL. Because, I don't know, there needs to be better QA, more open test cases, etc. So if you suddenly notice that your application is failing or is performing badly, it might have been because you got upgraded to MySQL, a newer version, a point release of MySQL. And this happens to be because you were automatically upgraded. So if you were running at SCaLE and you knew more about MySQL or you were a DBA, you would test the upgrade first to make sure it doesn't negatively impact your app before you actually upgrade. Whereas here, you don't have a choice. Not only RDS, you really just don't have a choice. They just upgrade you automatically, and if your application slows down, you have to go figure out why or complain loudly. So keep that in mind. And this happens even in 5.6 for what it is worth. Though when Amazon did introduce 5.6, it was introduced at a much later stage where I would say 5.6 was a bit more performant. If you're going to benchmark, there are two possibly good benchmarks. Sysbench has several workloads, update heavy workload, read only workload, etc. Read, modify, writes. You can run them. You can run Sysbench against all of these providers. In fact, this is exactly how you get all those credit card miles, because when you run Sysbench, you spend a lot of money. And the other one that's actually worth checking out is the Yahoo Cloud Serving benchmark, which actually works pretty well against MySQL, hosted MySQL. You can run both of these fairly easily. There are no public roadmaps when it comes to storage in the cloud, because when they announce something, and you know it, the competitor will most likely announce something the next week, and you will also know it. Usability really varies, so I thought I must include at least one screenshot. This is HP Cloud. It really needs work. You can create instances, but if you don't happen to specify a username and a password, it'll still allow you to create the instance, but you will never be able to log into it, ever. You'll then have to destroy the instance and start it again. Google actually does allow you to have instances to be on demand, always on, or never on. I think this is kind of handy. Google also allows you to reserve an IPv4 address when you have on demand. Reserving IPv4 addresses, again, is kind of handy, because otherwise you get new addresses all the time. You pay for the privilege, but you don't pay much for the privilege. So usability really varies across the systems. I'd say in terms of usability, AWS has a winner, followed by Google and Rackspace, who are dueling it out. Now, a few tips on running MySQL in EC2. You can have multiple geographic regions with regular replication, or you can use semi-sync replication, or you can set up Galera cluster if you want. This is something you cannot do with RDS. You can also obviously run anything besides regular Oracle MySQL and have no limitations. You can also use EBS volumes for InnoDB table spaces, and EBS has equivalents on the others. You can also warm up partitions. You can't do that with RDS. Pretty much all of them now have SSD storage. Some even offer Fusion IO equivalent backends, so I don't see you using spinning disk as a big problem anymore. You can monitor with external tools, Nagios, Cacti, Vivid, Cortex, etc. You can still make your snapshot backups, save them to object storage like S3. This one will allow you to use front-end tools like Elastic Load Balancer in front of MySQL. Now, not many others have an ELB equivalent, but for Amazon, this is actually kind of handy. I like the idea of spot instances because you can actually save money if you're testing or you think you have spikes at certain points in time. MHA is great for automatic failover. Also, when it comes to loading data, or you want to provision new slaves, MariaDB has a start transaction with consistent snapshot, as does Percona Server. They've ported it. Or you can also use a tool like MyDumper for parallel dump or load. These are all things you cannot use with RDS or any other database as a service. So, in closing, I would say that hardware really varies per region. Software manageability, like in HP, can also vary per region. I've noticed in production, Rackspace can have runaway databases. You can't kill the database from the interface. So, and you can wait, and nothing will happen. The interface is basically hung. It's a runaway process. So then you actually have to poke support and get the ops team to go kill the runaway process. But this all happens on your dime, by the way. You're paying for the privilege of this problem. Costs are going to be recurring. They can increase if you have different instances. I highly recommend a backup credit card. Google and Amazon allow you to store more than one credit card number on file. This is probably useful in production because you don't want your services to go away because your card provider suddenly decides to deny the charge. And when it comes to costs, AWS really wins so far. It's like the cheapest. Rackspace is a close second. HP Cloud is there as a discount, but you get the trade-offs of the fact that it's a very beta service and you probably don't want to use it. I think even if you go to the HP booth upstairs, the Helium Cloud booth, they're going to tell you that it's more for you using it in your private cloud instances as opposed to the public cloud. And the sad part is the most expensive one is Google, and it's not most expensive by a small margin, but it can be most expensive by like 30 or 40%, even though they've dropped the prices. But there are people using it, so they have reference customers using it, and it is also the other one where you can get Galera cluster with a one click. So I have time for questions. I'd recommend you to download MariaDB if you have time. And as a bonus, we have a booth upstairs, so you can always come up and talk to us about your cloud needs, if you want to run on EC2, if you want to run on RDS, and so forth. So, do I have any questions? Yes?
Do you have opinions on Amazon Aurora yet?
Yes, I do. So I actually have access to the preview. I checked with Amazon 2 days ago if I could talk about it, and they said no, not during the preview. So you also have access and you can't talk about it. Yes, this is a huge problem, and this is being recorded, so I also definitely cannot talk about it. But if you can get access or apply for it, I highly recommend you to try it.
What is it?
Amazon Aurora. It's basically it's claimed to be a lot faster than regular MySQL, but it speaks the MySQL protocol, and the bonus of it is that it's geographically replicated as well. But it's still in preview, and we don't know when it gets launched. So you have to apply for beta access, so you provide them your Amazon ID, and then they will give you access if they feel like they should give it to you.
In their public statements, they say it's 5 times faster than RDS.
Yes. But that's as much as we can tell you now. Yes.
Synchronous replication, multi-master, or
according to the documentation in public, it is synchronous replication. The best we can give you is whatever is in public, because I don't want my account to be disabled or worse, get sued. Yes. Yes. So the only bit about Azure that I mentioned was all the way in the front, because Azure doesn't actually offer MySQL as a service. They offer SQL Server. But if you want to use MySQL, and a lot of people actually do, they run their WordPress blogs on Azure, they end up using ClearDB as the MySQL store. And ClearDB is a third-party company that's a relatively small company that does MySQL in the cloud for Azure and Heroku. I personally don't know how viable they are. Like running it in their compute instances equivalent. Yeah, you could totally do that, because when you get Linux, they offer Linux on Azure. You can totally run MariaDB or MySQL on Azure. I personally have had no experience with Azure because we've never actually found anybody ask for it, or want to pay for anything around it. So I've tried it in my spare time, and I've used ClearDB. I don't really think that they're like a very long-term viable company. That's my opinion, though. I could be wrong. Do you work for ClearDB? I'm very wary about recommending where you could store your data in third-party sites, because I've seen in the last just 2 years companies come and go pretty quickly. Yeah, GenieDB had a lot of funding, and then they just went bust. And they went bust silently. They didn't even have the courtesy to tell their customers, hi, we're closing down. At least Zground had 2 weeks of notice. They said, hi, we're closing down. Please move your data to ClearDB. That was a bonus. Now, I don't know about you, but if you store your data in the cloud and, tomorrow you wake up and your app stops working, this is a sickening problem to have. So that's why I focus on the big ones. And Azure doesn't want to host anything but SQL Server themselves. Everything else is done through partners. I think they've even talked to us before saying we should host like MariaDB for them, but we have to go into the business of actually hosting, and we're not, a hosting company. Well, not yet anyway. Yeah. But you can totally use, they give away a lot of free credits as well, so like you can run in their compute instances, run MySQL, just like you would, like you would manage it yourself, like in an EC2 instance. Any other questions? If not, thank you very much for listening. And we finished on time, like exactly on time.